I would request Lawrence to start the second session, please.
Thank you very much, Kishore. So we have the next four presenters. Mohammadi, who's talking about potentials of privately owned public spaces for city reactivation in post-pandemic time. Then we have Chris Lee, who will talk about public life, realizing road reallocation projects in Vancouver beyond the pandemic. Then third, Maud Signon, pandemic-informed urban adaptation strategies to challenges of climate. And the final one, reimagining neighborhood spaces for physical activity and social connectedness, Rebecca Myers. The viewers, who you already know, Tanzil Shafiq and Bushra, Dr. Bushra Abbasi has not yet spoken, but then we have also Dr. Ifeka Ahmed and Vedran Skopak. So
I have something to add. So Han Rashkur is going to respond to Mohammad's paper. I think Han is already here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome, Han. So we can go straight to Mohammad. Could you start your presentation? You have 15 minutes. I'll remind you at 10 minutes and at 13 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Mohammed Mohammadi. Can you see my presentation, the slide? Yes, thank you. I'm going to present part of my PhD research with my supervisor and co-author, Quentin Stevens in RMIT University, Melbourne. In this research, we present potential of privately owned public spaces for city reactivation and sustainable development in post-pandemic times. I'm very happy that I follow up the Kim Dawi presentation and the idea of populate as part of prioritization of public spaces, and also the presentation of Tani, who is speaking about the urban interior. The idea of public spaces created in 1970s, a type of public space has been formed based on government and private sector partnership, known as privately owned public spaces. They are created based on a bonus space at the ground floor of the building to build higher towers that have to contribute to the public life. Contributions such as easing congestion of footpaths, providing opportunity for stationary activity. Over last 5 decades, the aims and regulation of this kind of public spaces have been developed, but they still have ambiguous design and management practices as some kind of policy-made public spaces. The idea of increasing privatization of public spaces has been discussed as a concerning issue rather than a positive approach to our public space improvement. Concerns about reduction in diversity and freedom of public life. Also, many other declare, privatization of public spaces as decline of public spaces and even the end of public space at the beginning of this movement. On the other side, recent researchers believe that POPs, POPs is abbreviation of privately owned public spaces, have not experienced such extreme situation and they have more optimistic viewpoints. They focus on potential of parks as a new type of public spaces. Our research followed the positive approach and focus on activity-based approach in examining how the built environment can encourage or discourage the presence of various user and activity within POPs. It identifies different design and management practices that encourage and discourage various social uses and activities, especially when access to public places get restricted during COVID pandemic. Our research finding will be discussed here to elaborate on the potential of POPs to fill the gaps in delivering accessible and usable public spaces. Also discusses the role in the reactivation of the city in post-pandemic time. In 2019, as part of my PhD, we did field observation in 4 cases in Melbourne. We observed and recorded detailed activity map of social activity in pubs. The findings of this research are based on 87 visits in different seasons, weekdays, weekends, and both night and daytime. In total, 1,035 activity, including more than 3,000 users, were recorded during the observation period. None of the observation period happened during the lockdown, but we were trying to extend the finding to the post-pandemic time. Observation showed the potential of pubs in attracting diverse activity. Several case studies successfully host different kinds of activity after working hour of the towers when restaurants and cafes are closed. The public use them for their social and individual activities at different time of day and night. However, the most common activity are related to consumption activity like eating and drinking. For understanding the encouraging and also discouraging special feature of pubs, we use Nemeth and Schmidt framework, which is consists 10 discouraging and 10 encouraging features and how they may impact publicness and public use of those kind of spaces. We developed this framework and added 10 new features to this list, which are highlighted in green. Several features were introduced as encouraging feature in this list, but observation showed different evidence and different impact of those kind of discouraging features, as you can see in the slides. In this presentation, we mainly focus on encouraging features of the pubs for social activities. Observation of the pubs in Melbourne show that pubs can encourage public life in many ways. The successful case study usually have a diverse sitting area with several sitting types, like formal chairs and tables, and also informal seat like those kind of concrete and stone flower edge. As you can see in the picture, the findings showed a specific correlation between sitting type and user characteristics. Several other features impact user activities like the diversity of seats, the relationship with the nature, and also providing the shade area. And the rest of the features will be introduced in the future slides. Pubs host social activity and create possibility for social encounters among users and also strangers. We were used for, we observe both group and individual activity. As you can see on the table, there are a lot of individual activity along with the group activity, especially two-person group activity. In terms of gender, both male and female users were observed in pubs. Mapping activity based on user characteristics lead us to understand discouraging and encouraging design and management practices for each user type. For example, gender activity map at the right side elaborate on the desirable sub-areas in interior spaces and how they can host different kinds of activities based on the genders and the number of users. Also, observation show that the user freely can appropriate pubs feature for their social activities. They change the arrangement of pub seats for bigger groups and create activity territories for themselves. Based on Kaufman's 4 level of encounters, pubs provide social settings for co-presence of user in public life. Bill Hillier argues that co-presence of public in co-presence in the public spaces are valuable sources of social life, even without any conversation and interaction between users. At the next level of social engagement, pubs usually facilitate co-attention. People watch other people or events happening in the space. Users focus on the same thing at the same time. What William White calls triangulation in public spaces. The other two levels involve more active engagement between user and also strangers. Pubs create occasions for joint social activity by hosting event and program activity. They have program activity encouraging co-exchange and co-actions among strangers. Members of public can participate in joint activities which require interactions between users. In such ways, pubs facilitate high level of public engagement in urban spaces. The social potential of pubs drawn from field study and observation will be discussed here based on sustainable development goals and how they can contribute to having more sustainable cities in post-pandemic time. Each of those can pubs can contribute to healthy social lives by introducing alternative activity destination based on people needs and distribute them to new and different city areas. You can see how different would be the city with pubs and without pubs. This map is part of my PhD, and I introduced gray map as a new way of seeing the city. Fieldwork suggests the potential of pubs as alternative activity destination which attract a specific user at particular times. This includes insight observing nighttime activity of young people and also women in pubs, which can contribute to the community mental health, especially for youth. Pubs are controlled by active security camera and security guard, which create safe and secure spaces for children, young girls, and women. Pubs provide eyes on a space similar to James Jacobs' idea, especially at night when the other public spaces are closed or poorly lighted. Such features lead us to expand equal opportunity and access and strengthen community participation in public life. In successful cases, pubs form a strong connection between city spaces and the community, and strengthening community participation, especially for those who don't feel connected with others, like older adults and people with disabilities. Observation of recent physical intervention in Melbourne pubs show that they could transport to more usable spaces for such type of user. All of the examples lead us, those kind of examples lead us to the potential of pubs for reducing inequality. Several observations at the weekend and nighttime, when all office towers and retail stores were closed, show that public users occupy pubs for their social activity without purchasing or buying any food or paying anything. They are free and provide various facilities and services for social gathering, like air conditioner spaces, free toilets, power outlets, free Wi-Fi, and safe and secure spaces. In contrast to the pub's literature, the presence of the security features like guards and camera work as an encouraging feature, especially for girls and youth. There were minimum interruption of activity by those management features like security guards. Pubs also host several types of movement activity. In some cases, they provide cross-block connections and facilitate city movements. Also, pub users wander around the space and pause for a while, explore the space, and then left the space without doing any stationary activity. Such movement activity can have positive economic impact on pubs and business around them. During the pandemic, lots of city spaces were left without users. The absence of such users, like office workers, greatly impact the livability and economic resilience of the central cities. A special potential of pubs encourage more persons to come into cities and go to the small businesses like cafes and restaurants around them. Pubs supports the long-term stationary activity and encourage more potential customers for businesses who are impacted by the absence of office workers in pandemic time. At the end of this research,
You have 2 minutes.
thank you. Yeah. This research result emphasized on pubs as a public and private partnership to be an effective and resilient solution for sustainable development of publicly accessible spaces. Participation of pubs in the city and the national events show that people use those spaces as part of the city, and they effectively contribute as continuum of public spaces to host social activities. The finding also emphasized the connection of pubs to the private host buildings as an important factor in social life. In those kind of successful case studies, the journey of going from a fully public spaces to fully private spaces happened to a path with no clear boundaries, and the user cannot feel how they change this kind of level of publicness and privateness. Those spaces have combination of private public spaces and also connected to the public lives, private spaces. The combination of these two concepts can improve the social life and use of pubs, and also impact the public life of the cities. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much. We will go to the next presenter, and that is Chris Lee.
Can everyone see the slides?
Yes, yes, we can see.
And
And
okay,
we can hear you.
and so advancing. Okay, and we can. Okay, thank you. Hi everyone. I will be presenting our chapter titled "Public Life Realizing Rural Reallocation Projects in Vancouver and Beyond the Pandemic." As the other co-author of this chapter, Kathleen Corey, is not able to attend this morning, I will be presenting the chapter on our behalf. So today I will be discussing tactical urbanism in Vancouver, and in particular, rural reallocation projects implemented during the pandemic. On March 18, 2020, the province of British Columbia in Canada declared a state of emergency in response to the lawful coronavirus pandemic. Quick build projects were identified as the opportunity to rapidly respond to make more room while many of us practicing physical distancing. More than ever, City of Vancouver policies and programs were aligned with the global tactical urbanism movement to explore quicker, more cost-effective ways to create spaces for gathering and community building. The aim of this paper is to capture and discuss how these tactical interventions were delivered under expedited timelines, which tools and resources were available, and what can be done to support public life and active transportation beyond the pandemic. We review great and scientific literature on the planning, design, and implementation of tactical infrastructure for cycling and public space published before and during the pandemic. City of Vancouver datasets were mapped to analyze the quantity and distribution of 3 of the 6 typologies across neighborhoods. Quantitative data for each typology were also being summarized through comparison tables. Semi-structured interviews were conducted one-on-one with 4 key City of Vancouver staff identified as playing a critical role in the pandemic response projects. And as subject matters, ourselves, me and Kathleen, we engaged in action research when writing this chapter, reflecting on direct experience in this project as City Vancouver staff. So Vancouver has seen a decade of placemaking and public infrastructure under the tactical urbanism umbrella. The first parklets in Vancouver was standalone pilot project from 2011 to 2013, led by business and designers. Growing interest from the business community prompted city staff to introduce pilot and fully fledged programs in 2013 and 2016. Inspired by San Francisco's Pavement to Parks program, the term Pavement to Plaza was developed to describe similar roadway conversions to public space. Vancouver's first 2 Pavement to Plaza were installed along Brook Street in Davie Village and on Watson Street in downtown. When designed, located, and programmed appropriately, Pavement to Plaza encouraged people to linger while complementing active transportation. In 2019, City of Vancouver staff reviewed both the Parklet and Pavement to Plaza programs Recognizing gaps in public space and distribution across the city, we identify opportunities to further build upon community partnership. While the pilot program was put on hold during the pandemic, this effort was redirected towards delivering pilot parklets in the downtown east side, which I will explain later on about this work in the presentation. 6 typologies were identified as role reallocation priorities for implementation during the city's pandemic response. Each was built up on municipal programs and pilot projects predating the pandemic. From left to right, room to queue, making more room to line up for access to essential services. Room to move, repurposed roadway for increasing space for walking, rowing, and cycling. Slow streets are an evolution of room to move for local streets with traffic calming measures and speed limit reductions to improve safety and mobility in residential neighborhoods. While social service parklets are designed and built in partnership with social service provider to create a space exclusively for the community. Side street plazas convert a street block into places for public sitting and gathering and close to motor vehicle traffic. Curbside patio are fully detached from restaurant, requiring patio permits to allow table service and enclosed by railings, typically occupying parking spaces. The dashed line in this map representing neighborhoods in Vancouver are part of the 22 local plannings area identified in the 1960s. For the purpose of this paper, we included the downtown east side neighborhood boundary as shown in the gray tone with the dashed line. Prior to the pandemic, there were 18 parklets and 5 plazas in the central neighborhoods. The number of plazas increased to 20 during the pandemic in central neighborhoods where there are concentration of retail streets, with the exception of West Point Green and Marco, which are further away from city core but still located on commercial streets. Contrastingly, 13 out of 15 new parklets built were concentrated in the downtown east side, supporting social service providers and community centers. The number of curbside patio grew exponentially from 7 to 467 due to council direction to support business recovery and new design guidelines for temporary installation. Meanwhile, majority of 20 room to queue locations that were installed are StaffNet initiative to address crowding on the sidewalks in front of essential businesses. Public space infrastructure in the form of side street plazas were drawing more interest than parklets from business improvement associations for providing more open space to the reopening of businesses, as well as overtime places to gather and socialize and opportunities for programming. Whereas new form of parklets began with utilizing the same temporary materials as room to queue became a more suitable typologies in rapidly deployed in the downtown east side. This table is showing the total cycling network in Vancouver is approximately 330 kilometers, including 42.3 kilometers added for pandemic response. The map on the right is showing the cycling network in Vancouver before the pandemic, illustrating the overall distribution connecting each neighborhood. In terms of distribution of active transportation infrastructure during the pandemic, this map illustrates that most of the slow streets installed are shown as the thicker dashed line, were concentrated in the central and eastern suburban neighborhoods, connecting to existing parks, community centers, and in some locations, creating a loop that helped facilitate opportunities for exercise. They involve multiple neighborhoods to encourage walking, cycling, rolling on residential streets. Whereas room to move projects shown as in the thicker continuous line were implemented adjacent to Sunset Beach and Kids Beach to address crowding. This map is highlighting compatible infrastructure for public space and active transportation, and further reinforcing that during the pandemic, most side street plazas were intentionally located on the bikeway and or slow street to support daily trips to and from commercial streets. The City of Vancouver's public life recovery response and planning during the pandemic can be described as a three-phase approach. In viewing this tactical projects delivered throughout the pandemic, a progression was observed following an iterative approach, evolving each space in terms of material and needs. During the acute response phase, Vancouver reached a moment when it became a spatial public space equity issue, with many of the room to queue, room to move, and South Street locations identified and initiated during this time. Simultaneously, we were seeing the first iteration of social service parklet installed in the downtown east side. In pilot, maintain, and enhance phase, there was citywide demand for more public space in the context of supporting physical distancing and social connection. Converting a block of side street into public space became a more cost-effective solution in maximizing the use of roadways. Transition phase focuses on upgrade approaches to programs as ongoing, seasonal, or obsolete, and regrouping for spring 2022. The downtown east side was most impacted with an immediate need for community services to serve people in the neighborhood. The same challenge also applied to other social service providers across the city. In 2014, Council approved the Downtown East Side Plan, outlining strategic directions to improve access to public space, such as the creation of parklets in partnership with community groups and residential associations. During the pandemic, engineering and social planning worked together to deliver parklets for the first time, from the initial planning to design and implementation of the spaces. During the acute response,
5 minutes.
During the acute response phase, many projects were delivered using existing tools available within the organization. The need to respond quickly create an exceptional challenge for the city, where the review and approval process were expedited and streamlined to address needs and process gaps. This initial installation, built as quickly as possible of construction materials, poses many challenges at the beginning in terms of scalability, cost effectiveness, ongoing maintenance issue, and accessibility and safety concerns. They were later enhanced using semi-permanent materials. For example, cones on Beach Avenue were upgraded to an extruded curb, as shown in the photo on the right. In partnership with Business Improvement Association and community partners, additional amenities such as greenery, seating, and other programming and placemaking opportunities were also introduced during the second phase in side street plazas and parklets. In the downtown east side, scalability was most important in order to address as many locations as possible during the acute phase. The downtown east side is where many folks are experiencing the impacts of multiple systemic barriers, including the overdose crisis, street homelessness, lack of access to social and cultural spaces, and gentrification pressures. In addition, the lack of ongoing partnership between the city and social service providers in the area poses many challenges in delivering safe and welcoming public space infrastructure. Community engagement led by social planning was completed in 2021 with social service parklets organization and parklet user, resulting in strong support in prioritize many of the spaces for upgrade to switch out temporary construction materials to semi-permanent ones. Snow Street social service parklets and side street plazas are transitioning towards a prioritization strategy to improve neighborhood distribution by reflecting on equity matrix as part of developing a planning framework. This summer, the city adopted a new equity framework, which will help develop tools that can apply in future. During phase 1 and phase 2 of the pandemic response, several businesses inquire with the city requesting conversion of parklets from public space to curbside patio use. These parklets were completed with limited financial support from the city. On the other hand, the original intent of the spaces were being freely available to the public. This increased the tension for restaurants who have funded a parklet when before a curbside patios were not an option. Prior to the pandemic, the parklet program was under review with staff encouraging a shift to nonprofit and organizational sponsors over business for parklets. The pandemic reinforces This, particularly as new business had the option for applying for curbside patio permits. We also see during the pandemic that business improvement association have become more interested in side street plaza than parklets. The shift in prioritizing parklet in the downtown east side can be seen as a model for delivering social service spaces across the city and to some extent continuing the work of a community hub that was first identified in the community plan in 2014. In conclusion, from partial to full roadway conversion, the majority of tactical measures for increasing access to public space and mobility were initially reactionary. This rapid response projects addressing public life and active transportation continue to evolve over a concentrated period of less than 2 years, while Roam to Queue was phased out when public life restriction would lift. Curbside patios pivot from pilots to a seasonal program, whereas parklet program was put on hold to reprioritize efforts on delivering parklets in the downtown east side. Meanwhile, side street plazas, Low Street, and room to move locations garnering public support during the pandemic to remain in place contribute to the overall city's public space and active transportation infrastructure. Now in transition space, there is a moment for reflection on recent work to refine programs predating the pandemic based on lessons learned on efficiency, scalability, equity, and partnership. And once again, thank you for listening to our presentation.
Thank you very much, Chris. I forgot, thank you for mentioning that you co-authored this article with Kathleen Corey. And I would also like to say that Mohammed co-authored this article with Quentin Stevens. Now, the next presenter is Maud Casagno. Please start your presentation.
I will start. So my presentation is called Pandemic Informed Urban Adaptation Strategies to Challenges of Climate, Environment, and Health. And my name is Maud Casagno. I'm currently at Monash University and I'm transitioning to RMIT University and also have an office X-based architecture and urban design. My presentation is structured into discussing pandemic impacts on city and the relationship to density, talking about adaptability and tactical urbanism, then about crisis as a chance for new ideas through precedents. I will talk how COVID was masking the climate crisis, but then also showing the way how adaptation could happen on other fronts, and how a project aimed at climate managed also to address issues flagged by the pandemic through an example. And we'll talk about scalable, progressive, and networked approaches and the link to tactical urbanism, and conclude with overlapped opportunities of networked approaches to COVID and climate. When COVID started to take over our lives, the first reaction was one to see density as a main contributing factor. But soon it emerged that it was not the densest places in our cities, but the ones with the worst access to open spaces, be that balconies or parks, that suffered the worst outbreak, but also whose life quality was the worst affected, being crammed inside apartments with really difficulties to isolate. But what COVID also showed us was that cities fastly adapted. After the first lockdowns, councils allowed to turn space into alfresco terraces and street lines into bike lanes, especially also in Melbourne. People and communities started to reappropriate street space through drawings, temporary interventions, and the pandemic brought the importance of public space and community activation to the fore. This activation remained even through the recurring lockdowns in Melbourne, which were the longest in the world, basically. They kept communities together and allowed a sense of shared agency in the process and in these really difficult times. A movement emerged in local and business communities to turn temporary parklets and bike lanes permanent. And what was conceived as a one-off by councils was later embraced long-term. this pathway of temporary to permanent measures had parallels in tactical urbanism strategies. The measures are tested with communities at a small scale and for a short period of time, and then readjusted and finally made permanent. And sometimes, which you see here, and sometimes deployed progressively over larger territories, as you see in this map, which was done by the Footscray Council. And here you see a latest Yarra Council magazine, which shows that these measures have become permanent, or this example from Paris. This type of massive street or parking conversions would have been unthinkable before the pandemic. For instance, one of Yarra's fastest declining streets in Australia was blamed before the pandemic on unpopular parking reduction because of widened tram platforms. And there was a really strong community opposition at the time from struggling business owners. Whereas during the pandemic, the reduction of street space and parking was embraced both by communities and businesses. So there was a strong discrepancy of the perception of such measures before the pandemic and after the pandemic as becoming all of a sudden feasible for councils. Another aspect which my paper highlights is that crisis adaptation is not without precedent. For instance, there are the Victory Gardens during the World War in New York, Paris, London, which were done in public parks or along boulevards, formed a precedent for such type of short-term adaptation. They helped nourish a population stressed by food shortages, but they also built bonds. They gave people a sense of agency in stressful times and a common goal. What was also interesting to see that already then the vegetable gardens appeared, disappeared, and re-emerged later as urban gardening movement during the ecological crisis. They similarly created a sense of community. As you can see in still existing community gardens in New York. And also a set of shared values and goals reminiscent of the Victory Garden posters, which is interesting. There's similar aesthetical ways of communicating. Another aspect which is really interesting is that the COVID crisis also masked a larger crisis that had happened before, the climate crisis. And here you see some COVID protests happening in the same space than the climate protests in the years before. COVID masked the climate crisis, whose protest it interrupted and put place in our consciousness. The movement, which had just gained global momentum, was interrupted by stay-at-home orders or made more difficult by social distancing. But the crisis also simmered under the surface, just to come back and break out, and recently in unprecedented events around the world which show a need for action, like the mudslides in Germany, the heat waves in the US, or the flooding in China. While COVID distracted us from climate, it also showed us tactical strategies which we may use towards the climate crisis. And it also showed parallels, how we need to adapt spaces for better pandemic prevention and climate mitigation at the same time. Creating green spaces and cities for integrated design, which can be used towards cooling cities, but also for contagion prevention. And these outdoor spaces can host recreational activities. They can create better circulation, as shown in the presentation before. They can create connection and well-being between populations in stressful times. They can ventilate, cool, and shade at the same time. And they also create healthy urban ecologies, which contribute to healthy living and mental well-being. So all these aspects are really important in both types of crisis. I reviewed the project, Cool Lines, which was done prior to the pandemic climate, but also really feels interesting as a look through the lens of COVID. We had investigated how a post-industrial suburbs in northeast Melbourne could be shielded against urban heat island effect, the effect of hard surfaces creating extreme heat in cities, and especially in industrial areas with a lot of hard surfaces. Our proposal developed a strategy of continuous cooling green-blue corridors to reconnect existing urban pockets and parks, and the aim was to use those spaces for evaporative cooling and ventilation, as well as pedestrian and ecological corridors and open spaces. A series of strategic interventions proposed to close the gap in the network between the existing spaces. One intervention proposed an overflow reservoir for the old Elizabeth Street flood regularly because it was covering an old river. At the center of a green open air overpass with shops, it would be naturally ventilating using convection. Another proposal of urban farming was designed to draw cool air into the streets. A revived old wetland under the freeway would create an indigenous estuary park with outdoor cultural programs to complement the indoor cultural programs which are prevalent in the city. An elevated floating housing near a creek would privilege cross-ventilation and outdoor spaces and also create flood-safe housing models. A silo was proposed to be reused for outdoor sport while misting an artificial rainforest and cooling airflows, complementing the typical indoor gyms which are very popular in Melbourne. The schemes and proposals were presented at an exhibition at Melbourne Design Week and allowed us to gather community and community feedback. Later, the project went this year to the Venice Biennale as a virtual film presentation, which is accessible through this QR code and which you can access at a later stage. The events led the City of Melbourne, with whom he had done the project, for whom he had done the project, to start 2 new initiatives. A mapping tool, which is interactive, where you can enter your address and which shows you the coolest way through the city between 2 points, and Cooling Our City, an initiative that incentivizes private urban to create cooler spaces throughout the city. But the project also showed how COVID's tactical urbanism strategies could inform climate strategies to be deployed progressively, where temporary or local projects could be deployed one after the other, create momentum to do more of them, and then be networked progressively together. As a conclusion, I want to say that this review showed me different aspects and different correlations between climate crisis and the COVID crisis. What I found was that breezeways throughout cities and breezeway networks can both improve climate and health. They can reintroduce ecologies which create better air, better ventilation, heat and water absorption, and better climate. They can create spaces for activity, socializing, and connection, aspects that were really highlighted as being extremely important in cities, and when deficient, create outbreaks. They can contribute to livability, health, and well-being, all aspects that have strongly suffered in the pandemic. Network strategies are advantageous because they can be progressive and they can be expanded. They can mix temporary and permanent interventions of different scales, and they can employ tactical urbanism, temporary to permanent strategies to be implemented. So creating first temporary interventions, learning from the feedback, making them permanent, and using the learnings from one intervention to inform the next. They can be upgraded, expanded, and retrofitted. And as decentral solutions, they're easier to manage, they're easier to maintain, and user engagement is much more feasible than large one-off type of strategies. And also, interestingly, the cost can be split between different councils or even between councils and private owners. The other thing which I saw is that crisis can be an opportunity for renewal. It can actually lead to something positive. The response to the pandemic, for instance, can show to be a model for climate response. But we can also learn from earlier crises from different areas and learn from what they've generated, because this is not an unprecedented situation. Cities have always had to react to different types of crises and natural events or non-natural events. Also, what I found interesting is that crisis allows you to operate fast, much faster than outside of crisis, and also incrementally allows to mobilize momentum through temporary measures to create permanent change. The other thing I found was that there were many commonalities between COVID and the climate crisis. Both have physical and mental health implications. Both demand adaptation to our cities if we want to keep the cities livable. They show advantages in improving green and open space networks, the public realm. And in that they respond to Senat's call for greater porosity in cities. Another interesting aspect is basically that the urban common, or rebuilding the urban common, has shown to be really important, and that this can be done through as green-blue networks throughout cities. And this is an interesting aspect after a decade of privatization of public spaces, which was discussed in the first paper, that actually the importance of the urban common has been revealed through this pandemic, and that we have to go back to. The other thing which both crises reveal is that it's important to improve equities in our cities, both in the face of climate change, which unequally affect different populations in cities, but also in relation to the health crisis, which also have shown to affect different parts of the cities more intensely, especially those which didn't have access to public spaces or to pedestrian networks, and which were much more isolated and had less chances to isolate themselves. The other things which I saw is that the benefits of prevention, adaptation, and mitigation really came out beyond climate and infection prevention. They can increase health and well-being and environmental connection. It can improve circulation, socializing, exercising, cultural activities, gardening, which all contribute to healthy cities. And also what is interesting is because such measures are multifunctional investment, they provide good return on investment for municipalities, because you target multiple issues at once and you get the positive returns accumulate. The other thing which is really interesting is it also increases the quality and value of surrounding area and the attractivity. And so in that sense, longer term, they will provide a return in investment for municipal income in form of higher tax value coming back, being able to be reinvested in public spaces. Meanwhile, the absence of these strategies has shown to lead to movement against density and the movement away from cities. In Australia, we have noticed that more and more people are actually leaving for suburbia or for rural areas, and the suburbanization and encroachment on nature. Ever more territory is basically rezoned to create new dwellings further away from the city, which further destabilizes nature reserves, farming land, and destabilizes global environmental health. So this is not really. Sorry?
You're way past time.
Okay, so I would just conclude with cities, that cities are both a source of the problem and the solution. as Stern and Dengli said, and if we manage to catch the moment. And that's where I start my presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have our last presenter, Rebecca Myers. Could you come on, please?
So I'll make this one quick. Thanks for coming to this talk and taking the time to read through our chapter. Today I'll give an overview of the chapter called Reimagining Neighborhood Spaces for Physical Activity and Social Connectedness. And this work was done with my co-authors, Troy Glover, who's in the audience, and Krista Costas Bradstreet. And it was funded by PHAC, the Public Health Agency of Canada. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Waterloo, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And this land is not only land that we inhabit, but a space that's constantly politicized, where identity politics are ever present in the planning and urban practices that we're talking about today and throughout the conference. So in this presentation, I'll give an overview of the common vision, the pandemic experience in neighborhoods, delve into the social relevance of neighborhoods, and go over the tactical urbanism strategies that we outline in our common vision toolkit. So what is the common vision? Well, currently half of Canadians remain physically inactive. And the goal of the common vision, which was created by PHAC, is to increase physical activity and reduce sedentary living in Canada. And one of the champions of this project, CPRA, which is the Canada Parks and Recreation Association, has been tasked with working on these spaces and places area of focus. And this area is intended to explore the neighborhood as a location of physical activity and social connection. And this is what we were tasked with doing. So the pandemic, as we all know, greatly outlined our lack of social connection, and it was made worse by the social and physical distancing we had to do. And as a result, Canadians' lifestyles and a lot throughout the world became more sedentary in nature than ever before, renewing the urgency to increase physical activity and our connection with others, not just through online practices. So our work for the Common Vision Spaces and Places project was happening at the same time as the pandemic. So this shifted what we were thinking about in terms of physical activity and connection, and considering most people were constricted and staying local the majority of the time, they were spending it in their neighborhoods. So from that thinking, we focused on the importance of our neighborhood space and the opportunities for residents to both re-envision, repurpose the otherwise mundane spaces so that they could work for them. However, these opportunities to re-envision and repurpose public space are in fact not equitably distributed or treated the same. For example, during the pandemic, we saw both a crisis of environmental justice and equity with a heavy policing of public space where Black, Indigenous, people of color were disproportionately targeted when it came to the enforcement of public health restrictions. At the same time, these populations represented the majority of essential workers during the pandemic. So public space initiatives and street closures didn't always engage residents because they were done so promptly. Previous presenters discussed the speed at which these initiatives took place, but often with not very much community engagement, which cities are very much critiqued that they don't do in the first place. So this emphasized the need for us to consider more resident-led changes and then at the neighborhood scale to help engage and motivate residents on a local level to with supportive resources to foster both healthy activity and social connection. So Smith and Lim in 2020 found that the pandemic brought about this greater social isolation. And for us, this really detailed the importance of creating resources for residents to adapt the built environment for themselves and others in their neighborhoods. We focused our project on the neighborhoods as a place for re-engagement, mutual solidarity, and local identity. And we saw a glimpse of these tactics during the pandemic. Previous presenters spoke about these tactics, but we'd also like to encourage these sorts of activities moving forward. So Chris, you spoke about, 400 different projects plus. So we want to keep these projects happening, but also from a resident perspective. So we started off with an environmental scan of the best practices and policies for improving the built environment to encourage physical activity. And we found that there was a lot of top-down approaches in planning and the built environment for health and social connection. More importantly, we saw this lack of grassroots types of initiatives in the literature, at least, and other planning documents. So what we did see, though, were a lot of examples of Canadians sort of hacking their homes and their neighborhoods to get by and to meet their own needs. So we ended up gathering these tactics through our research and wanted to know what residents could do, both at a resident level, but also a community level. So a lot of this, the juxtaposition is sort of seen in these two photos where you have a street closure, mainly done by transportation departments. And then you have this sort of musical event done by residents outside of their own home, which is the difference between this, who's leading these initiatives. So this tactical placemaking showcases this DIY, do-it-yourself neighborhood building, and it draws on much needed attention to the way that built environments are designed and offer tangible interventions to how to make them better, including better for physical activity and the social connection. So inspired by this tactical placemaking, the Common Vision Spaces and Places Toolkit, which is currently still in the works, just thought I'd preface that, envisions the promotion of physical activity and social connection driven by Canadians themselves through grassroots animation of neighborhood spaces. More specifically, it draws upon 8 animation tactics outlined by Troy Glover, co-author in 2020, and can be adapted to enliven the built environment and encourage more physical activity and social connection. So I'll just go through these 8 tactics to give you a little taste of these animation strategies. So first, neighbors can what we call naturalize neighborhood spaces by adding natural features to green a neighborhood landscape like community gardens, pop-up parklets. Second, they can activate neighborhood spaces by using physical activities to draw active participants and spectators to a neighborhood space. So these are things like a neighborhood ice rink, wayfinding walks that give you a little tour of the neighborhood, or fit paths that can use some low-cost equipment to draw your neighborhoods into a fun activity. Third, neighbors can colonize the neighborhood space by making, eating, or even selling food. These are things like lemonade stands that we saw more of in the pandemic, cookouts, mobile food trucks like this produce market in Toronto to give healthy and equitable access to healthy foods. Fourth, they can spectacleize neighborhood spaces by casually or formally hosting entertainment like a pop-up movie in the park or concerts. And fifth, neighbors can festivalize or eventify neighborhood spaces by organizing an event. Things like in the pandemic, open streets or closed streets were becoming more popular, but then things like huge festivals weren't a thing because they attracted too many people. So we had these sorts of resident-led porch fests and very neighborhood scale events and festivals that things like music and arts and drama that were happening. And then 6, they can aestheticize neighborhood space by using art to brighten up these mundane landscapes. I've done some yarn bombing myself. There's yarn bombing on bike racks, on trees, all sorts of places. And then things like changing alleyways into art galleries. So even in Vancouver has the alley-oop in where is it, in Gastown, yes. And other places that even turn trash can into art. This photo is from a place, city in India that has a showcase of local artists on their trash cans. And 7th, neighbors can co-vivialize neighborhood spaces. So this was seen a lot in the pandemic in order to safely gather and discuss local topics, hosting things like a listening booth, just come and sit and gather, tell me all of your woes. Chair bombing, just the practice of bringing chairs to a neighborhood space that don't have seating to give access and have people stay a while. Things like these prompt boards, before I die, it doesn't have to be something so morbid, but something to bring the neighborhood together, or even coming together as seniors to learn more about computer programs, things like Zoom that have been popularized in the pandemic. So how do we give everyone access to these sorts of tools after the pandemic is done? And then 8th, neighbors can, last but not least, gamify or whimsicalize neighborhood spaces. Things like adding game design elements, painting hopscotch boards, using their phones to interact with different features, things like Pokemon Go, or even sometimes other features like swings at bus stops that add this sort of whimsical nature to public space. Yeah, so all of these approaches contain the potential to attract more individuals to use their neighborhood spaces, not just for sociability, but for physical activity as well. Just a few lasting thoughts is that 1, this chapter underscores the social relevance of neighborhoods as a fundamental domain within the public realm. 2, it outlined the innovative tactics identified by the Common Vision Spaces and Places Toolkit to assist Canadians in building their neighborhood back post-pandemic. 3, the evolution of our thought process really began with the importance of physical activity, yet overwhelmingly evolved to emphasize the importance of neighborhoods, both for physical activity and social connection. And 4, ultimately, the pandemic experience, social relevance of neighbors, of neighborhoods. The toolkit really offers creative tactics for Canadians to reimagine public space and how it works or doesn't work for them. So here are some of the references for this chapter. And I'd just like to thank you very much for attending this talk, and I look forward to chatting with you all.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that very interesting presentation, and you've presented it in record time.